I don't know if you can see Thelonious Monk dancing around his piano. There was no piano there in this performance, but I'm sure he would have done just that. He would have done a quick little tap and just been knocked out. The woodwinds at work here, under one artist, multi-tracking, laying it up and layering it up. But I'm going to ask him more about that. His name is Nick Brignola, and I found him on the East Coast. And I'm keeping up late after a long night of work and engagement somewhere. Nick Brignola, welcome to Minnesota Public Radio.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to playing out there next week.
Yes, you'll be working with the Lakewood Community College Jazz Ensemble, Larry Newman,
Right.
and their company. And I must ask you, because my curiosity here, you went into the studio with soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, all of those things.
Right.
And first of all, how did you did you just visualize the music and want to, just lay the woodwinds on it?
No, what happened was we went in and Kenny Barron and Dave Holland and myself, we did all the trio playing that was done on the album. We did that first with the arranger who had an electric piano, and he was piping it into our phones, and he played simulated woodwind parts, so we kind of know vaguely what was happening. I mean, there was no way to really know what was going to happen until the finished product was done. It was more or less like putting a puzzle together. But we did the trio tracks, and then Dave Holland and Kenny, that was the end of their participation in the whole session. And then I went back for several days and put all the other woodwind parts over what we had already done. And I really didn't hear the whole thing until it was all done. So it was more or less really like putting that puzzle together. A little piece here, a little piece here, and play this flute part and do this. And each, I went right down the woodwinds. Sometimes we would start with the lower pitched instruments and work up, and then depending on the tune.
And with Thelonious Monk's Around Midnight, that's rather wild.
Well, what I did there is I did the bass clarinet part first, which kind of implied some time because I did the whole thing. There were no other musicians on there but myself. So
no rhythm section.
No, I needed a little bit of a bottom there, so I went and put the bottom parts on first, and then the last thing I did was blow the solo over all the woodwind parts.
Oh, well. When you heard it back, was it what you had visualized in your head?
Yeah, it was pretty close to what we had decided to put down. On paper. It came to fruition on the final cut. So we kind of knew. I knew vaguely what was going to happen, but you never really know until it is. It is there. Then that's it. You know what it is, and you can't change it either.
Nick Brignola, tell me, did you have a score for Round Midnight, or is that improvised?
Oh, no. All those parts were written except the solo.
I see.
Baritone played the solo, and all the other parts, everything was written. Everything was written down. And Mike Holliver was the arranger on this particular tune, and he wrote all the parts. And that was another reason I really didn't know what it was going to sound like until it had already been done.
And after you heard it, what did you think?
The baritone solo, weaved it in and out of what was going on, and that was it.
I see. Well, after you heard it all in playback, what did you think?
I was very happy. It's one of my favorite albums because it not only because of all the work and dedication that we had to it, but it was just... It perked up a lot of people's ears because they don't figure me as that kind of a player, and I've always kind of been very evasive as to what kind of player I really am, because I really like to play all kinds of jazz music, and I don't like to be pinpointed. So this album kind of presented a whole other side of my music.
Minnesota Public Radio and Classical 99 is talking to Nick Brignola, who did all of the woodwind parts on Round Midnight, including the solo. There's another personality that figures into this session. He's legend in the recording industry, Rudy Van Gelder.
Right.
Aye.
Rudy was, when we proposed this particular recording to Rudy, because I had done several recordings throughout the years at Rudy's, he was a little hesitant. It was like, well, first of all, you're not using drums, and this is going to be a lot of work, and, you know. And we just said, well, we want to do it, and let's see what we can do. And then once we got into the project, Rudy was into it, and, you know, really did his job, you know, and he was very happy with what turned out. It was a new experience for him because he had never done anything like that.
And that's really saying something for all of the sessions that Rudy Van Gelder is noted for.
Right. He's recorded all the masters, you know, from the 60s and 50s and 60s right up through now. He's still recording many of the great jazz musicians, and but he has more of the sound of most of the records that you would hear on the old Blue Note sides, the sound of the 50s and the 60s of what jazz records sounded like. That was, you know, Rudy's doings, because he was one of the first people that used to go around and record musicians right on the gig. He would bring the tape recorders and set up, and so he became the guy back then, you know, and all the major record companies wanted him to do the recording because that was his sound. But, you know, we've come a long way since those, you know, really crude tape recorders and some of the equipment they use, the microphones, and the recording industry now is such that even Rudy now sits behind a bank of computers and has an assistant with him, you know, and it's a whole other technique. But yet the sound that he gets still kind of is reminiscent of those earlier sides.
I can see Alfred Lyon of Blue Note Records with Francis Wolff hanging around Rudy and getting those early Blue Note sessions down.
A lot of history.
A lot of history. And you're a part of history, too.
Well, I would like to think so, but, you know, when you're actually still doing it and everything, it's kind of hard to think about, you know, what may be down the line, but I would like to think that I did contribute something, you know.
Well, certainly you also were associated with one of the most famous of the big bands.
Oh, yeah. Woodrow
Wilson Herman. Well, that's not quite right in name.
Well, we called them all kinds of names.
Yeah. Oh, there's a new book coming out, I understand, on Woody, and I'm sure we who are Woody Herman fans should look for it. There's a man on the West Coast who has put it together, I understand.
Right. You know, his name slips my mind there. I'm trying to. They did call and interviewed me, and they interviewed many of the sidemen that Woody had, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting book. But Woody was a character that he was a great guy. I think his forte was he was probably the best, if not one of the best, but I think the best band leader that ever lived, because he had such a great rapport with his sidemen, and you know, there's a lot of stories about some of the great band leaders like Benny Goodman and how they were distant and very arrogant and whatever adjective you want to use. But Woody was always one of the guys and liked to, if he had a particular player in the band that maybe took the music in a little bit different direction, he would be the first one to let that person solo and do it. He was always looking for the new stuff and always allowing his soloists to play rather than stifling them like some of the band leaders did. But he was a great guy. I wasn't with the band that long, actually, but I communicated with Woody throughout all the years. I was only with the band about 4 or 5 months in 1963 and 64.
When you first joined the band, can you remember what your impressions were?
Oh, yeah, I was scared to death. I don't know whether you know it or not, but I'm completely self-taught. I never studied music or never took lessons on any instrument except about 2 or 3 months of clarinet lessons when I was 12 years old, and I hated every lesson, and that was the end of it. It completely turned me off. But I really couldn't read well, and Sal Nistico, who was the star saxophone tenor player there at the time, was a very good friend of mine, and he got me on the band, and I couldn't read well. So the first 2 weeks on Woody's band were very hairy, with him looking over at me, and I'm scuffling through these parts. But I have a very quick, or at least I did back then. I don't know how quick it is now, but I was able to memorize and I picked up really fast on some things, and when something, a particular line that I was having to read, and musically, if I couldn't read it, I would have the fellow next to me play it, and then I would just know how it went, and then I would just play it. So after about 2 or 3 weeks of all kinds of gigs, I got to the point where I had most of the music memorized, except when Woody would pull out a chart that we hadn't played before, and then I'd have to start all over again. But at that point, I had proven myself as a soloist, and he liked me, and he knew how I operated, and he was willing to let me stay in the band and function under those conditions. But I finally did get so I could read really pretty good, so that's how I kind of learned. So I have to credit Woody with allowing me to sit there and make my mistakes.
So you really were in a road academy, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, I learned right on the... In fact, the first night, I always tell some of the students that I come in contact with, the first night I ever work with them, the book was in very disarray, it was out of order and everything. I think the fellow that was preceded me got mad, and he probably screwed up all the parts. But I got there, and, number 25 was right next to number 78. And so when Woody would call these numbers out, you would assume they were going to be in order, and they weren't. And that was another stumbling block I had to get over. And by the time I got the music out, the band was halfway through it, So I was really scared to death the first night. But he finally let me solo. I think that's what convinced him, because I was just another guy sitting there trying to read, and then Sal kept saying, let this guy play. So I forget. I don't even know what song it was, but it was all I know is Real Fast. And it was like, okay, kid, if you want a solo, get out here and play, And I did. I went out, and I realized what was happening, so I put my best foot forward, and I think I played about 16 choruses or something. And when I got through, he was smiling, and, at that point, I kind of knew that I was in. So, but beyond all that, I think Woody's contribution is he had so many great bands, and he was always for the moment. He was trying to keep up with the times and almost set the pace for what bands should sound like. And the bands always had almost a small group feel to it, rather than the cumbersome. Not that I'm putting Stan Kenton down, but his band was a little bit cumbersome at times. Very heavy with brass and everything. Woody liked his band to function more as a small group, and therefore that lent itself to, for soloists to really be happy in a good environment.
Which makes for a great jazz band.
Oh, yeah. It was unquestionably one of the great jazz bands. There were a lot of great bands, but this band, Woody always seemed to come up with the best. And somebody once said, if you ever lined up all Woody Sidemen 4 abreast, you'd probably go around the world at least once. A lot of musicians went through that band.
Yes, indeed.
And the bands currently still exist, under the leadership of Frank Tiberi. In fact, I did a guest solo appearance with them last year, and they're scuffling now, like most of the big bands. It's just economically not feasible to have a band like that on the road, but they're still trying to carry on the tradition, and I'm glad it's Woody's band trying to do that.
Nick Brignola, it's a pleasure to talk with you about not only your experiences with Woody Herman, but that hair-raising pioneering that you did in the Rudy Van Gelder's studio in doing the multi-tracking of the woodwinds. And we're going to hear more of it in a moment. I just want to invite our listeners to meet you and the Lakewood Community College Jazz Ensemble next weekend, Saturday and Sunday, February 4th, in White Bear Lake, Minnesota, just outside of St. Paul, for the 6th Annual Lakewood Jazz Festival. And I hope the weather is good for you here, and I know you're going to influence a lot of students and fans as well.
Well, I always look forward to these kinds of experiences where I can get together with some of the younger musicians and maybe whatever secrets I have, or little trade secrets or little things I can pass on. That's what it's all about, and I'm really looking forward to playing with the band, and I just hope the weather is nice.
Yes, well, come prepared anyway, as they say.
I know, it's 5 degrees below zero here, so I don't know, maybe we have bad...
Oh, it's spring out here at the moment.
Well.
Well, we're in the 20s. Well, keep warm, and we'll see you next weekend.
Okay, thanks for having me, and see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you.